So this month, February 2023, is the 1-year anniversary of my having completed the first draft of what I consider to be one of the best things I've ever written. A 6-episode limited series set in the world of Bungie's Destiny franchise. Why did I do this? What would compel me to write over 200 pages of fanfic that certainly would never get made? Well, there's a few reasons. Firstly, I just love this universe, and I enjoy existing within it. But secondly, I often let my pipe dreams get the better of me. Now, in early 2022, Sony announced they were acquiring Bungie for a whopping 3.6 billion American doll hairs. All the press surrounding the acquisition seemed to indicate that Sony was interested in Bungie's talent for video game development, yes, but also that they saw the potential to spread Bungie's IP to other storytelling mediums. Transmedia potential, Bungie called it. Books, comics, movies, TV shows, the works. It was all suddenly on the table. Now, with my own original fiction at that time stagnating and struggling to find its own footing, I turned my pen to the world of Destiny, with the distantly absurd notion in the back of my mind that perhaps one day I'd be in a position to properly pitch a story to the execs at Sony and Bungie. Fanfic has been a key outlet for me in my broader writing processes. At various times of writer's block working on my own universes and stories, I found that turning my mind elsewhere can eventually help unblock previous dams built up in my mind. This was the case after I finished my Rise of Skywalker rewrite in late 2019 and my own pod racing screenplay in 2021. After each of those moments, I dove back into my own book and found that writing it was a lot easier. And then as once again I found myself having trouble getting into the second act of my novel, I began thinking of writing a Destiny story. And it also seemed marginally more possible that I could actually get a script in front of Bungie and Sony than in front of Disney and Lucasfilm. But what story could I tell in the Destiny universe? The world of Bungie's most recent science fiction adventure is vast, reaching all the way back to 2014 when the first entry in the series was released. And ever since that moment, the story of Destiny has been told and archived in multiple places. The very first in-game narratives in Destiny were one thing, but launched right alongside them were smaller, often self-contained stories in the Destiny Grimoire, which you could access outside the game itself. Destiny 2 has pulled much of this additional storytelling material into the game's actual user interfaces, but you still don't need to engage with it to advance the week-to-week narrative of Destiny's ongoing seasons. It's this breadth of narrative content that makes the task of spearheading the first big-screen Destiny adaptation a bit daunting. And since the Sony acquisition and Bungie's hiring of various filmmaking professionals from around the industry, think pieces have been swirling around the web of everyone's ideas for what the first piece of Destiny big screen entertainment should be. But very few people, it seemed, were really taking into consideration the sheer complexity of the world of Destiny, and how best to lay it out for a general audience, and instead just offering up their favorite stories from the extended Destiny universe, regardless of how well they might serve as a real introduction to this world. Now, famed Destiny fan historian My Name is Bife had a great piece about this, essentially comparing a potential Destiny show to that of Netflix' The Witcher, and noting that while The Witcher is of a slightly more unique fantasy setting than some others, broadly understood fantasy genre conventions give The Witcher a, quote, common threshold of knowledge between all its viewers, those that have played the games and read the books, and those who haven't. Destiny, on the other hand, is a sprawling blend of a bunch of styles of genre fiction, landing squarely in the world of sci-fantasy, but at times even veering into horror. It's got magic, it's got spaceships, it's got aliens from our universe, it's got aliens from other universes, it's got ancient gods ruling over other planes of existence. It's a really complicated world that demands a lot from those seeking to fully understand it. And so where exactly would you begin to introduce people to that world? Well, I knew exactly where I wanted to start, and exactly what I wanted to write. I've known for a long time. It's a part of Destiny I often told my friends and raid partners well before any of this news had come out would make the perfect Destiny TV show. I wanted to write about the first Crota fire team. Now, a brief aside here for those of you who might be watching and got to this point and think, okay, so this guy owns Final Draft and decided to use it to make fanfiction. Cool, why should I care? Well, I'd like to think that I'm not just some hobbyist writer, and let me explain to you why. I am an award-winning filmmaker, both for my college short films and a documentary I edited just out of school. I have an Emmy Award for my involvement in a friend's short film. It's a regional student Emmy Award from the Ohio Valley chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, so do with that what you will, but I'm still proud of it. I've had my flash fiction and short stories published in journals and zines, and if you look up my name on IMDb, you will see a variety of listed credits from actor to director to editor to camera operator to writer. I say all this not to brag, but to hopefully establish some semblance of my own credibility in your mind so that all this next part doesn't read like the ramblings of a passionate fan, but that of a passionate storyteller. So the story of the first Crota Fireteam comes from Destiny's first story expansion, The Dark Below, introduced in December of 2014, but was greatly expanded upon in Destiny's Shadowkeep expansion in 2019. The story is bleak and tragic, and yet full of hope and heroism. It's a story of vengeance and a story of betrayal. But better yet, as a potential introduction of the world of Destiny to a different medium and a broader audience, the story of the first Crota Fireteam is relatively simple. For all intents and purposes, the Hive are the only enemy faction you have to worry about in this story. Now, are they as easy to explain as the Fallen or the Cabal? Maybe not, but they're certainly not as complicated as the Vex. And unlike the Fallen or the Cabal, the Hive, at least in this story, have a singular, clearly defined leader, Crota, a clear, uncomplicated antagonist. You don't need to futz about explaining the hierarchy of Elixni culture or all their different houses or any of their kells, and the Cabal didn't have a clear leader until basically the launch of Destiny 2. So the Hive, for all their weird religious goings-on, end up being the easiest enemy faction to initially explore. Secondly, while Destiny is a vast planet-hopping adventure most days, this tale takes place primarily in one interstellar location, the Moon, allowing for a clarity of setting. Though arguably the most difficult challenge of any Destiny adaptation is just establishing the rules of how this universe works. At a basic level, you need to inform your audience about how Guardians work, about the light, their ghosts, and how they can come back from the dead. But even more importantly, how situations might arise where they cannot be brought back from the dead. Now, I came up with a few solutions to these issues, all of which I think lend themselves organically, specifically to the story of the first Crota Fireteam, which I was now calling Destiny Ocean of Storms. Because this story takes place in the wake of the Great Disaster, this horrible battle where thousands of Guardians died on the Moon trying to fight the Hive, I wrote a memorial scene in the first episode where the eulogy given by the speaker, voiced by Bill Nighy, outlines the concepts of resurrection and final death. Not in any great specificity, but enough that the audience is like, oh, okay, these people can come back to life if need be, but sometimes they just don't. This also teases the audience. Well, why can't Guardians always come back from the dead? It becomes an open question that we can answer later on in terrifying and dramatic fashion. I also wrote a short scene where Sai Mota is in the middle of a Crucible match, where I'm able to visually show the power of Guardian supers and the mechanics of how a ghost brings a Guardian back to life. Conversely, I also wrote a flashback scene of Lord Shaxx at the Battle of Burning Lake to show how sometimes Guardians can't be brought back to life, and heavily implying that there is something sinister in Hive weaponry capable of preventing it. Creating clear stakes so when the first Crota Fireteam decides to go back to the Moon, we know exactly the risk they are taking. Everything beyond that is window dressing. You don't really need to try to explain the Traveler or the Vanguard or the Consensus or why everyone on Earth only lives in one big city. All of that can be explained visually or not at all. We just let the audience learn all the other rules of this universe as the story organically evolves. But most importantly to my pitch for this TV show, the events of the first Crota Fireteam take place well before anything involving the player character. Though there have been many absolutely fantastic television adaptations of video game properties, most recently Netflix Castlevania and HBO's The Last of Us, there have been enough flops over the years, see Paramount's Halo the series, that there is still a stigma about adapting video games to other visual mediums. I think that most of the time, when an audience is unsatisfied with an adaptation of their favorite property, it is because they have a very personal expectation of what that story is supposed to be. What I found reading and listening to many fan reviews of Halo the series is that most lay people are not necessarily worried about whether or not the storytelling is competent, but rather that the storytelling is what they expected. Now, even in linear single-player video games, each person playing through the game is going to have a slightly different personalized experience of journeying through that world. And so there become a million slightly different canons in the mind of a million slightly different people. How then can one specific story from one specific perspective satisfy all of them? And then you look at Destiny, a multiplayer game where you can play as any one of 3 different classes of player character, each with myriad other customization options, and suddenly the task of centering a story around that person, the titular guardian of Destiny's many main storylines, becomes nearly impossible to do properly. But luckily for Destiny, it has a lot of other rich storytelling opportunities up its sleeve, like the first incursion of the Vault of Glass, the Reef Wars, the Iron Lords, and the Dark Age, or the story of Ariana 3 and the first Crota Fireteam. A story familiar to every Guardian who has ever stepped foot within the tower, but one of which they have never seen the full truth. Only fragments of the story have ever made it into the game, leaving much of the tale up to the imagination of the player, and at this moment up to the imagination of me, the writer. Now on February 4th, 2022, I opened my first story document, a Google Doc upon which I outlined the narrative arc of Ocean of Storms. I knew I wanted to use as much of the pre-existing narrative material as I could, filling in the gaps in the story with my own text. And so began many nights of scouring IshtarCollective.net for all the scattered lore entries and grimoire card flavor text that I could use to make the skeleton of this TV show. By February 8th, I had completed the series outline and written the first episode. My pace would be frantic for the rest of the month, finishing the 2nd and 3rd episodes on the 10th and the 12th, the 4th episode on the 17th, the 5th episode on the 22nd, and the final episode on the 25th. I wrote 240 pages in 17 days. That's crazy. I don't know how I did that. It certainly helped that about 10 to 15% of the show was already written by the narrative designers and writers at Bungie, and that the broad strokes of the arc were already established, but still. About halfway through this process, on February 15th, I emailed what I had, the first 3 episodes, to another filmmaker friend of mine, the friend who actually made the short film for which we all collectively won that student Emmy, looking for feedback and notes on the story. He had no familiarity with the world of Destiny, and so seemed like the perfect candidate to critique the work. Him being part of the broader general audience I wanted this story to appeal to. The process of him sending me notes and me sending him rewrites extended well into May as we adjusted, polished, and cleaned up the 6 episodes I'd written. I've continued to perform smaller rewrites since then, even doing a somewhat final grammar pass just yesterday to make sure all 6 scripts were as clean as they could be, because I want you to read these scripts. Now, I understand why nobody at Bungie ever responded to my messages the past year. There are legal liabilities and so forth to even looking at something like what I'd written, even though they are wholly the owners of its associated intellectual property. And nowadays, most folks in the industry won't even look at anything that they themselves didn't personally request to see. And further still, they won't typically request anything from anyone but real talent representatives. And what rep in their right mind is going to sign 6 episodes of glorified fanfic from a nobody writer in their late 20s. Much as I may have wished the opposite, any true production of these scripts was doomed from the start. But even so, I want somebody to read them. I think what I've written has broad appeal to fans of Destiny, as well as genre enthusiasts of all kinds. You know, it's got some fan service, sure, like a character asking for classical music only to hear classic rock, harkening back to one of the very first live-action Destiny commercials, or a scene where Eva Levante says, "Please call me Eva." But at its core, it's just a story I really think is worth telling, and the story I think would make for the best introduction of this universe to a broader audience. It's a deeply human story about 6 people seeking to find some semblance of peace and hope in the wake of monumental tragedy. And I hope I've done it justice. I just really, really love these characters. I'll leave a link in the description below for the pilot episode, and maybe just the pilot episode for now. My goal, I guess, with this is that I hope it can get spread around enough to catch the attention of someone who can do something about it. Either I'll get an email from someone at Bungie's legal department telling me to can it, or somebody from Bungie's transmedia department asking for a chat. Or, like has been the case the past year, nothing will come of this except maybe a few of you telling me, hey, that sounds cool and this script is good, which would be nice, if not the most ideal outcome. So, anyhow, what do you think about this idea for a Destiny TV show? Where would you begin? What story would you tell? I hope that soon we get some news about Destiny's ongoing multimedia development, but in the meantime, I'll just keep playing this TV show over and over in my head. Thanks for watching.